Wonderful. Thank you so much, Angie, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. Today, we will begin discussing hidden in plain sight, identifying and addressing metal exposures in daily life. No disclosures at this time. Okay, so we're going to go over a big topic today. We are going to identify the common and often overlooked sources of toxic metal exposure in everyday life, including water, cosmetics, and food products. You may be surprised to learn of the exposures for yourself and your patients. We're also going to differentiate testing modalities that will be utilized to assess metal burden, including urine, blood, stool, hair, and the implications for each testing modality. And finally, in a case series format, we will interpret metal exposure patterns in the context of symptom presentation. And at the end of this presentation today, you will be able to develop foundational clinical strategies to reduce exposure and potentially support detoxification using evidence-based tools. So we're going to start today. What are heavy metals? Heavy metals are naturally occurring elements that have a high atomic weight, therefore the name heavy metal, and the density is at least 5 times greater than that of water. These are used in industrial, domestic, agricultural, medical, and technological applications. So you want to be aware of these considerations for your patient's exposures. The most common known metals will be lead and mercury. We had leaded gasoline up until the 1990s, and that was a significant exposure for the majority of individuals in the United States. Other metals that are commonly assessed for: arsenic, cadmium, and chromium. And then the lesser known yet ubiquitous increasing exposure is going to be thallium, and we're going to talk about that today. Another consideration with metals is that we're having increasing exposure over time. So many of these metals, arsenic, cesium, thallium, uranium, they're part of the Earth's crust. But as we have industry, and we have the increasing of multiple industries, and over time, that increases the exposure for humans to these metals from the environment. And we will understand the effects of metals on physiology, including free radical production and oxidative stress. Additionally, the consideration with metals is that they displace minerals and enzymes, leading to physiologic dysfunctions. So metals molecularly mimic elements, such as thallium mimics potassium, lead mimics calcium, and gadolinium can mimic calcium. So you want to think about the physiologic processes where, example, potassium or calcium would be implicated, and understand that in the presence of that metal exposure, that there will be perturbed physiology. So we're going to start today with a quiz, and this is something you can think about for yourself and your loved ones and your patients. So this morning, did anybody use makeup or lipstick, deodorant, hairspray, soap, shampoo, or conditioner? What about nail polish? I know nail polish is very popular with children right now. How about any fried foods or grains? Depending on where you are, you may have had that for breakfast or lunch. How about utilizing a mattress, a cell phone, breathing the air, or eat your greens, veggies? And last but not least, has anyone actually been in the womb? I think yes, we all have. When we're thinking about these everyday exposures, lead is in lipstick. Every red lipstick has lead in it. There's also zinc oxide, titanium dioxide, nanomaterials. Deodorant has aluminum and triclosan. Hairspray contains SLS and ethylene oxide. Soap, shampoos, and conditioners contain petroleum, parabens, plastic, microbeads. Also some metal exposures as well. Nail polish has toluene in it. Fried foods contain acrylamide, and then a mattress may be a source of flame retardants. And also in that category, we also think of textiles in the home and fireproof clothing like pajamas. Cell phones are known to distribute electromagnetic frequencies. The air we breathe, simply the air we breathe, is exposing us to sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, carbon dioxide, chemical vapors. And then if you're within 200 miles of a steel mill or a coal fire plant, you're going to be exposed to lead and mercury. And indoor air is also going to be an issue because air quality, indoor air can expose us to metals, mold, formaldehyde. And then, unfortunately, as we're going to talk about, those dark green leafy vegetables may be a source of thallium. And we know that in the womb, we are exposed to over 200 toxic chemicals, including that very dangerous bisphenol A, flame retardants, lead, thallium, cadmium, arsenic, nickel, vanadium, cobalt, and mercury. Unfortunately, this is just not something that we as functional medicine providers are interested in. According to the CDC, the epidemic of epidemics of cardiovascular disease, immunological, and neurological disease is likely associated with environmental toxicants. So the environment is absolutely implicating our physiology, and that has a lot to do with oxidative stress and some of the mechanisms of action that we'll be talking about today. So these non-communicable diseases, which are the leading cause of healthcare expenditure in the United States, are associated with environmental factors. So we know that these environmental factors are intricately linked to our health outcomes. And then to further exacerbate these effects, the standard American diet is deficient in antioxidants. So therefore, it further exacerbates this oxidative stress and inflammatory pathway. So that is the state of affairs for human beings today. What is in our environment? We do have daily exposures that we've been discussing a little bit, but other considerations are going to be that these exposures are increasing over time. So it's not just that as industry develops, there's going to be additional exposures. So previously, we were really thinking about lead or mercury. Right now, we're seeing increased exposure to thallium, but we still have lead and mercury. So these are additive. Additionally, there's a bioaccumulation effect. There's a synergistic effect. So if we're exposed to one heavy metal, that is one pathological presentation, but we have multiple heavy metal exposures at one time in addition to plastic and the POVCs. So there's a lot going on in our physiology. And then, of course, the dose makes a difference. So it's important to pay attention to that. And it's important to consider that we're exposed to multiple doses of multiple elements and metals at one time. So how does this exactly affect our health? That's what we're going to talk about today. This is a growing environmental issue, as we have been discussing. So we know that leaded gasoline was an issue. We know that smelting was an issue. Coal burning fire plants were issues, and those have somewhat been remediated, although the effects of those metals doesn't necessarily leave the environment. And that's a whole other discussion in terms of remediation for metal exposure from occupational and industrial processes. Now, we have new exposures, new source of exposures. So e-waste recycling. So those batteries are going to be exposures for lead, cadmium, lithium. We know, and cobalt and nickel. So we know that that's a consideration for batteries. We also have with environmental shifts, we're going to be melting the permafrost, and that's going to be exposing us to metals that may have been trapped in that environment, such as mercury. Droughts and floods mobilize metals in soil and water, and these can contaminate drinking water and agricultural. Same thing with wildfires. Wildfires definitely can release metals from contaminated soil and infrastructure, also a contaminant of the VOCs as well. And then artificial turf is going to be a consideration as well. So older fields may contain lead-based pigments, or infill materials may have heavy metals themselves. Children play on these quite often. Tattoo inks, so tattoos may contain lead, chromium, and nickel, and those may enter the bloodstream. Urban gardening is a consideration. So for individuals that live in larger cities, you may think, great, I'm going to start a garden, but unfortunately that soil may be contaminated with lead and cadmium. Therefore, you would actually not want to garden in that soil. And that's a whole environmental consideration. Last but not least, what about vaping, right? So vaping might seem like a cleaner alternative to smoking. And how many times As physicians, have we updated our intake to ask patients about vaping in addition to smoking? Because we often ask patients about smoking, but we should ask about vape as well. So the vapes do contain nickel, lead, chromium, arsenic, and antimony. And there's a heating mechanism involved in this as well. So when you're going to be heating those materials, that's going to potentially allow them to leach. And then some flavor additives may contain metals as well. So in individuals that are vaping, I would certainly consider metal exposure as one of the myriad health effects. Unfortunately, this just gets worse. So, with regards to what we think about with our patients, we do recommend that women during gestation take prenatal vitamins to best give health for themselves and the growing infant. Unfortunately, they had a study in Canada in which they tested 26 prenatal vitamins over the counter. Every single sample contained lead. 20 of the samples exceeded the established standards for lead toxicity, and one sample had very high value. Cadmium levels were within normal limits, but each supplement had aluminum, nickel, titanium, and thallium. Titanium and thallium, I mean, these will cross the placenta. Elevated maternal lead is associated with low birth weight and significant issues with regards to lead exposure during development that can lead to a variety of health consequences, including but not limited to cardiovascular disease, behavioral disorders, IQ. So that's a very dangerous situation. To further the situation here, humans, we are on the top of the food chain. And so, with regards to the metal exposures, they don't decrease during each step through the food chain, right? So, unfortunately, if we have metal, let's say from a smelter or from an industrial exposure, once it gets into the soil, it is into that soil. Sometimes they can utilize plants to remediate these, like mustard greens and things like that, because those plants can actually take up from the soil these metals and concentrate them in their stems, and that could be a way to clean that soil. But more often than not, that soil remains a source of the exposure, lead, mercury, etc. And sometimes these industries are going to calculate, the cost of remediation versus the cost of simply leaving that there. Sometimes they will take a giant like plastic bag and put the contaminated soil in that, and hopefully that will keep it contained, yet not likely. So really what happens is that we have these exposures and they bioaccumulate, so they're in the soil or the water, then maybe they're in the fish or the vegetables, and then we eat them. So that is the process, and it's happening every single day around us. And that is going to be a consideration about what level of metal is safe for you. So is it going to be the same as the other person, another person, a patient of yours or someone in your family? Everybody is a little bit different. And so age certainly plays a role. Gender plays a role, metabolism plays a role, body status plays a role, detoxification ability, glutathione status, all of those play a role. And then again, the synergistic effect of the metals is something to certainly pay attention to. As we have noted, we are in a situation where individuals are experiencing chronic metal exposure, contributing to chronic metal retention. This is well known and well established. So low levels of exposures are associated with long-term effects not previously recognized. We see this with lead. So the established lead limit in blood used to be 45 and then they brought it down to 5. And there are some people that say it should be less than 3.5. And there are some people that say 0. No lead exposure is actually where you want to be. Because low level exposures, we are now learning, are associated with adverse health effects. So that is something that is known. And the knowledge of these adverse effects are based primarily on independent studies. But remember what we said, that individuals are exposed to multiple metals at one time. Rarely in the real world would someone be exposed to simply one metal at a time. So the studies are not quite aligned with reality of exposure. And of course, the effects of bioaccumulation are really not considered when we're talking about what level of lead is tolerated or what level of lead is expected. And then, of course, we know that metals can elicit independent, additive, or synergistic toxic effects. And that's going to be important when we look at sample results to see if patients have more than one exposure. You're thinking that there may be potentially synergistic effects. So, how exactly do metals disrupt physiology? We talked about molecular mimicry, such as thallium mimicking potassium, lead mimicking calcium. Well, what then can happen is this can cause disruption to ATPases, mitochondria, DNA, cellular walls. That leads to endocrine dysfunction. And when we're looking at metals, we want to consider that toxicity is based on the top 5% of the population. So we may want to take notice of metal levels that are below that toxic level, simply because that toxic level is the top 5%. And so the 95% of exposure is technically considered within normal limits because we are all exposed. And the toxicity of each metal depends on several factors. It's going to depend on the dose of that metal, of course, the route of exposure, whether it's inhaled versus ingested, the chemical species. We have a radioactive cesium versus a stable cesium. Age, gender, genetics, nutritional status plays a role, right? So some people have excellent detoxification mechanisms and they have a diet that is ubiquitous in antioxidants and supporting glutathione production, and other people do not, or maybe they're too young and they haven't developed that capacity. Here we have a diagram showing us that heavy metals directly disrupt nervous system, antioxidant systems, and transcription factors and regulatory proteins. So this is where we get the downstream effects of associated with carcinogenesis. We have associations with systemic organ toxicity. We have associations with increased reactive oxygen species, which leads to liver damage. So this can be associated with hepatitis, liver failure, or even liver cancer, and that could actually predispose one to worsening outcomes due to these exposures. We're going to talk about the connection with heavy metals and cardiovascular disease because that is very real. And with regards to mental health and mental status, these diseases, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, are just increasing in our environment. And we do know from research, there is a prominent researcher that believes if there was no aluminum exposure, there would be no Alzheimer's disease. There is definitely a connection between these nervous system disorders and heavy metal exposures. As we're continuing on here, metals influence health outcomes. Lead depletes glutathione. So more toxins, more lead exposure, you'll have less glutathione to deal with that. Once you have your depleted glutathione, you're going to lead to decreased mitochondrial ability. And that's going to be associated with aging and multiple myriad diseases. Lead exposure also damages the endothelial cells, and this will lead to inflammation. Higher lead levels correlate with increased carotid artery thickness, and we're going to talk about that in detail. Emerging research has shown us that even low levels of lead exposure, again, previously considered safe, are associated with increased cardiovascular mortality. And of course, the cumulative effects are very important because if we look at the peer-reviewed literature, it's not really represented as we're looking at the exposure of one metal at a time. Okay. Now let's take a look at common metal exposures. Although there's multiple metal exposures, for the purposes of this talk today, we are going to talk about lead, mercury, arsenic, cadmium, and thallium. Lead. So lead is a very common exposure. Unfortunately, in coal burning is going to be one of the most common exposures. The main areas in the United States would be Pennsylvania, Texas, Indiana, Kentucky, Ohio, West Virginia, Illinois, Missouri, and Wyoming. Now, it's going to be in that area, but also 200 miles within the radius, okay? Areas that formerly had lead smelters, mine, or industrial sites may have contaminated soil. There are quite a few striking cases in United States history with lead smelters contaminating the air. If maybe the filter wasn't working and there was a elementary school across the street from the smelter, they do know that those children were exposed to exorbitant amounts of lead. And so this is definitely a consideration. Now, lead-based paint was around prior to 1970. So again, if the home is built before 1970, could have lead-based paint. Lead-based paint is simply a better product. It's brighter, it covers better, it has a better white, so that's why they used it. But unfortunately, if it's going to fleck or it's going to cause lead vapor, you're going to be exposed to lead in your home. Leaded gasoline was around until 1996. Unfortunately, that exposed many individuals to lead in the atmosphere and in the environment. And leaded plumbing is still around, so check the water if you're in an area where there was leaded plumbing. I live in the Midwest, and so what they did in the Midwest is they really had all of the plumbing, the town plumbing, but then the plumbing going into your house is going to be leaded, and it's up to each homeowner to replace that line that goes from the main to your house. So leaded plumbing is definitely an issue, putting lead in the water. And of course, manufacturing, glass is going to be a consideration. Unfortunately, leaded glass crystalware is still around. You can find that in antique stores or resellers online, and it actually helps with the taste of the wine, and so that's why they were using that. And many imported products, especially toys, so be aware of that for your pediatric patients. And for herbs purchased overseas, again, the United States, for what it's worth, we do have stricter rules with regards to exposures. Overseas products or individuals living overseas have greater exposures. So candle wicks would be a source of exposure. Some of the lead candles emit lead levels of 3,000 micrograms per hour, and that's going to be something that people are putting in their indoor air, right? So that would be very dangerous. All red lipstick in the United States has lead exposure. And so the consideration is that certainly toxic effects of lead. Lead is associated with decreased IQ, developmental delays, low birth weight. There's even some findings that it may be associated with violent behavior, exposure in preschool years, may be associated with violent behavior in adult years. So there's certainly influences on that, the brain development. And individuals currently exposed to lead will have lower bioavailable glutathione because it displaces glutathione and it mimics calcium. If we look at the diagram here, we can see that lead exposure increases reactive oxygen species, is neurotoxic, and it dysregulates the antioxidant system. And so that's where you end up with the issues where you have lipid cellular damage, you have altered cellular functions, and carcinogenesis, leading to the presentations that we've discussed. One of the considerations with lead that doesn't get as much attention as it should is cardiovascular risk. So lead exposure is going to be increasingly recognized as a significant exposure to cardiovascular disease. We know that lead induces oxidative stress, damages endothelial cells, and impairs nitric oxide signaling. This inhibits vascular tone. So low-level environmental lead can inhibit vascular tone. Lead also promotes oxidation of LDL and alters inflammatory cytokines, leading to plaque formation and instability. Lead also activates the renin-angiotensinogen system. Calcium homeostasis, remember, it mimics calcium and therefore implicates blood pressure. Lead also impairs mitochondrial respiration, and cardiac myocytes. This leads to arrhythmias and reduced contractility. And in some studies, these associations were observed at blood levels less than 5 micrograms per deciliter. So today, the average blood levels are just over 1 microgram per deciliter, down from the average of 10 micrograms per deciliter in the 1980s. And again, that's largely due to the leaded gasoline. So here we have the information from a 2018 epidemiologic study published in The Lancet that discusses lead exposure and mortality in the United States. Researchers found that lead exposure was the leading modifiable environmental risk factor across all mortality categories. That would be including all-cause mortality, cardiovascular, and ischemic heart disease. Researchers concluded that even low-level environmental lead exposure, that's going to be less than 5 micrograms per deciliter, is a significant underestimated contributor to cardiovascular disease. And then here you'll see the dose response curve. So the graphs illustrate how increasing blood lead concentrations relate to mortality across the 3 categories there. So you can see that there is that statistical significance there. So it is reasonable to consider blood lead levels alongside diet and exercise when discussing cardiovascular disease. Next up, we have mercury. So the phrase mad as a hatter stems from a very real occupational hazard, mercury poisoning, amongst the 18th to 19th century hat makers. So during this time, hat makers used mercuric nitrate in a process called keratin to treat the animal fur for felt hats. They were working in poorly ventilated spaces and they inhaled these mercury vapors over time. Remember, we're talking about chronic low-level exposures over time. This was, moderate exposure over time, right? So this led to a neurological condition known as erythema mercurialis or Mad Hatter disease. So when we think of mercury symptoms, we think of the Mad Hatter: irritable, excitable, pathological shyness, tremors, memory loss, insomnia, depression, and even deliriums, hallucinations, and severe cases, you would see personality changes. So mercury vapor crosses the blood-brain barrier, disrupting neurotransmission and causing oxidative damage. The source of exposure today, while hat making no longer involves mercury, we have environmental exposures such as coal burning plants and engines. So China and cement manufacturing, they do carry over from China. So because we're in the US, we're not immune to these exposures. Global emissions, 70% of exposure in the US is from global sources. And the cement production manufacturing is going to be a consideration as well. And then once we have mercury in the soil and the water, it can leach and it can bioaccumulate. We do know that one of the considerations is going to be dietary methylmercury, so large amounts of fish intake, such as swordfish or shark, accidental vapor inhalation. If you have patients that really like to enjoy sushi, if you're on the West Coast, I would certainly consider checking their mercury levels. Dental clinics, mining, and smelting would be exposures as well. Again, fish and seafood is going to be the main source of exposure. This is going to bioaccumulate. You definitely want to pay attention because this methyl mercury is especially harmful to developing brains, posing risks to fetuses, infants, and young children. Okay, rice is going to be a potential source of contamination. So usually with rice, we think about arsenic, but you can't have contaminated water with mercury. Mercury thermometers, although less common of exposure, it's still an exposure. Fluorescent light bulbs, old batteries, and electrical switches. So don't let children play with old batteries. Okay, and then in 2013, the US joined the Minamata Convention to eliminate the use of mercury in products and industries. So the US is pretty good about that. Historical exposures would be skin lightening creams and cosmetics. You still can purchase those overseas, as well as herbal medicines. So purchased overseas, herbal medicines, definitely a consideration. If your patients are using those, something to consider for sure. Next up, we have arsenic. So arsenic is an element that's in the environment. It's naturally occurring in rocks, soil, water, and air, and in plants and animals. So it can also be released into the environment from man-made sources. Here we have an ad for a Dr. Rose's arsenic complexion. This is from the Sears and Roebuck catalog. This is a wafer in which it was advertised to just nibble little bits of this chalk wafer, and it's advertised as perfectly harmless to improve one's complexion. So we think that's very silly now, but we still have exposures in our cosmetics. Our exposures today are going to be rice, wine, seafood, mushrooms, poultry, kelp. And so it's really a large amount of food items because it is part of the soil and it does end up in the environment and in the bioaccumulate in the food, and then we eat it. It has affinity for the kidneys and the livers, so you're going to have compromised detoxification. Primarily, arsenic is detoxed via methylation. One of the symptoms would be elevated homocysteine, hyperhomocystinemia, and there is a correlation here with diabetes. Cadmium is next up here. Cadmium, one of the most common sources of cadmium would be cigarette smoke. Chocolate is going to be another source, and then organic fertilizers. So, organic foods that sometimes are used, the fertilizer is actually sewage. Cadmium is the source of that. And we have seen this in soy-based foods. So, unfortunately, something to look out for in your vegans. Cadmium carries an increased risk for osteoarthritis, an increased risk for myocardial infarction, especially in women, increased risk for oxidized cholesterol. Cadmium, we said, displaces zinc, copper, selenium, iron, and calcium. So you want to think about the processes involving those elements. There is a connection here with thyroid dysfunction. And of course, cadmium, there's likely going to be a co-exposure, and that's going to influence cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality. So here we have a diagram showing us that the sources of the environment, such as tobacco, water, and things like that, and food and vegetables, as we discussed, leads to oxidative damage in the organs and mitochondrial apoptosis, oxidative stress, autophagy, dysfunction, altered gene regulation. And so that is why you end up with issues in physiology when we have cadmium. So again, it's very persistent in the environment and the kidneys. Shellfish are going to hyperaccumulate cadmium. That's something to pay attention for. Again, cadmium shares the transporters for iron, zinc, calcium, and manganese. So you can consider supplementing with zinc. Zinc supplementation may decrease cadmium absorption in the gut, but it's not going to enhance cadmium excretion, okay? So low iron status also upregulates the expression of these metal transporters. So iron status plays a role with regard to absorption of well, and it does concentrate in the kidneys. So patients that have chronic kidney disease, hypertension, diabetes, coronary artery disease, macular degeneration, and cancer may have cadmium exposure. Thallium is the next metal that we are going to look at today. Thallium is famous in this Agatha Christie novel because it's the perfect poison. It is tasteless, odorless, and colorless, and it mixes well and easily into food and drink. So there are cases of thallium poisoning. Right now, we see thallium increasing in the environment, particularly in vegetables. It bioaccumulates in dark green leafy vegetables. Remember, we said that mustard greens are used to remediate soil, a similar mechanism of action, in that these dark green leafies really take up what is in the soil and put that in their stems and their leaves. So now we're seeing increased levels of thallium found in vegetables, fruits, and farm animals, especially kale. Even at low concentrations, thallium is toxic. The toxicity for thallium is higher than mercury and lead. It's found in the soil and the fly ash from coal-fired plants. It accumulates in bones, kidneys, nervous system, and it is associated with low birth rate. Recall that we saw that study that every over-the-counter prenatal vitamin had thallium in it, and it crosses the placenta, is associated with low birth rate. Thallium, again, mimics potassium. So think of the considerations where you have potassium. It's going to be cardiac, nervous system. So the presentation is going to be fatigue, ataxia. Alopecia is a cardinal sign. If you have a patient that's green juicing nonstop and they have alopecia, that is a great indication to test for thallium exposure. Other findings would be neuropathy, vision disturbances, headaches, depression, sleeplessness, psychosis, gastric acidity, loss of appetite, decreased weight, again, cardiac arrhythmias, angina-like pain, hypertension, and an irregular pulse. Okay, crosses the placenta, excreted into breast milk. So now I want to ask a question. In your practice, have you encountered unexplained fatigue, cognitive dysfunction, or hypertension that didn't respond to standard protocol treatments? What can you do? Well, we're going to talk today about the metal testing options. We do have some options for testing metals. Whole blood is always standard of care, so you always want to consider that is the standard of care test. Lead, mercury, take a look at the whole blood test. You do have additional options. You have hair testing, you have urine testing, you have fecal testing, and then you have the urine peripherin test, which we will look at through a clinical lens. Blood testing is the standard of care. So, whole blood metals are standard for diagnosis of lead, mercury, and other metal toxicity. This is collected via a fasted specimen, and this is useful for assessment of ongoing exposure. Limitation is that this does not provide information regarding retention of metals, example, historical exposure. But whole blood analysis allows for the measurement of the levels of both intracellular and extracellular circulating elements. So that is a great place to start. Urine testing is another consideration. So urine is traditionally used to evaluate exposure to potentially toxic elements and the wasting of nutrient elements. This can be a simple first morning void collection, a 6-hour collection, or a 24-hour collection. The results will be creatinine corrected. So, therefore, a 6-hour collection or a first morning void collection will yield the same results as 24 hours. So, unless you're doing 24-hour cadmium, you can simply use a first morning void collection that's very easy to collect. And these results represent approximately 2 weeks of exposure. Excuse me, the 24-hour chromium excretion is the best test for chromium. Urine toxic elements can also be included because this can provide convenient real-time assessment of recent ongoing exposures and retention of cadmium and thallium. Again, this could be a first morning void or 24-hour collection. It's very important with this test that you only use the provided collection containers and tubes because we don't want environmental exposures. The test is measuring very small amounts of the metal in that sample, and so external contaminants can certainly influence. Do not rinse the containers with tap water and do not collect the urine from a diaper because the diaper actually will contain metals and significantly influence the results. Patients should avoid fish and shellfish and sea vegetables 1 week prior to collection. That's important. Of course, we have hair testing as well. So, hair testing provides information regarding recent and ongoing exposures to potentially toxic metals, especially methyl mercury, arsenic, and the time average status of specific nutrient elements. This is non-invasive screening test, only requires 1/4 gram of hair and represents 3 to 4 months of exposure. So, this is a great screening tool. The toxic elements may be 200 to 300 times more highly concentrated in hair than in blood or urine. So, hair is the tissue of choice for detection of recent exposure to elements such as arsenic, aluminum, cadmium, lead, antimony, and mercury. And the CDC acknowledges the value of hair mercury levels as a maternal and infant marker for exposure to neurotoxic methylmercury from fish. Another option would be fecal metals. So, fecal element analysis provides a direct indication of dietary exposure to fecal metals, potentially the past 24 to 40 hours. The consideration is that for many toxic metals, biliary or fecal excretion is the primary natural route of elimination. This includes mercury, lead, cadmium, antimony, and uranium. So, this specimen collection is convenient for the patient and only requires a single step procedure. This is going to be measured via ICP-MS, and this is expressed on a dry weight basis to eliminate variability related to the water content. So, we're standardizing for that as well. All right, now we're going to look at some case studies to look at the information that we've discussed in practice. Here we have a first morning urine for an individual that consumed shrimp scampi the night before. This shows an extremely elevated total urinary arsenic. So, this, given the seafood intake, the result is most likely organic arsenic. Urinary arsenic elevation may reflect recent seafood intake rather than toxic exposure. So, organic arsenic, which is arsenobutane from shrimp, is rapidly excreted. That's likely what we're seeing here. This is not harmful. But this test does not speciate between organic and inorganic. Inorganic arsenic is the toxic form that's linked to cancer and cardiovascular risk. In this case, we need to remember the collection instructions to avoid fish and shellfish and sea vegetables 1 week before testing. So you want to retest after 1 week. Our next case here is a 7-year-old that was able to get a hold of elemental mercury. So this child is actually playing with mercury. We can see the mercury is at 15 micrograms per gram of creatinine. This is a urine test as well. That's very high. The reference interval is less than 0.8. For this individual, we also performed a peripherin test. Peripherin test is a simple urine collection that relies on peripherin pattern recognition associated with exposure to mercury, arsenic, lead in terms of metals. And then there's other patterns associated with hexachlorobenzene dioxin or methyl chloride or the POVCs. What we see here is this individual has a pattern that is associated with mercury exposure. So you have that confirmatory test as well. Now, here we have another test for a pediatric patient. This is a 3-year-old individual who's diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. This is a toxic and essential elements packed red blood cell. So here we're looking directly in the red blood cell. This is an important example. This is a clinically significant example, especially for a pediatric patient with autism spectrum disorder, where neurotoxic vulnerabilities are heightened. Here we can see elevated exposure to lead, and we can see lower status of calcium. So calcium is that first one there, very low, and then that lead in the red blood cell is elevated. So we know that lead displaces potassium. Lead enters via the calcium channels and displaces calcium in key roles, and this can implicate neurotransmitter releases, bone disposition, and enzyme activation. So this shows an example of a neurodevelopmental risk because elevated lead in the red blood cells here reflects chronic exposure and intracellular retention. So this may impair synaptic pruning, myelination, cognitive development. We know lead displaces zinc and superoxide dismutase, and it also depletes glutathione. So this patient's going to be at risk of higher oxidative stress, redox imbalance, and mitochondrial dysfunction. We also know that lead is associated with endothelial dysfunction, interfering with nitric oxide signaling, potentially impacting vascular tone and blood-brain barrier integrity. Here we can see that this is a significant pathological consideration for this young patient. So you'd want to pair this test with whole blood lead, assess clinical signs, and consider nutrient cofactors that we've been mentioning. Of note, zinc is within normal limits on this report. Additional consideration would be glutathione, especially in the context of elevated lead exposure. So we definitely want to consider the implications here for this young individual. And then vitamin D status would be helpful to consider as well. Here we have a urine test for a 14-year-old male that is insistent that there are absolutely no exposures. Unfortunately, we can see that this individual's urine test shows us that there is lead exposure. Now, the individual has a little bit higher antimony, so sometimes you'll see antimony and lead together in patients that are engaging in firearms hobby, or you have your patients that are deployed in the military. So antimony and lead go together. This one has antimony a little bit higher, and it has lead quite high. So these may be independent exposures. So sometimes you can see a pattern such as lead and antimony with a firearms hobby. This looks like an exposure for lead that needs to be delineated. and antimony. Now, remember we talked about at the beginning vaping, so in patients that, especially, well, any patient really, but even, teenage patients that say they have no exposures and you ask them about smoking, they said no smoking, but we didn't ask about vaping, right? So you want to identify and eliminate the source of that exposure. That's the most important thing. You can do a water test for this patient, and you can also follow up with a whole blood test. Okay. And then here we have another patient, switching gears. This is a 48-year-old female that chief complaint is major fatigue, cognitive dysfunction, polyneuropathy, hallucinations, and alopecia. Okay. So on the report for the 24-hour urine, we can see that thallium is extremely high. So this patient's thallium is a level of 8 micrograms per gram of creatinine, and we want it to be less than 1. This is a terrible exposure to, unfortunately, thallium via that daily AM kale smoothie. So this is definitely associated with that cardinal sign of alopecia. In this case, the patient needs to discontinue that kale smoothie, unfortunately. What can we tell our patients to do? Grow your own kale. Switch to like a broccoli sprouts or Brussels sprouts type of consideration. Broccoli sprouts, we would grow it in the mason jar. Maybe get the kale from, if you can, test your soil. If you grow it in your own yard, or if you're going to a farmer's market, you can have them provide you the information. But again, the issue is soil contamination and bioaccumulation into that vegetable and then into the human physiology, like we've been discussing. Thallium, major fatigue, cognitive dysfunction, neuropathies, hallucination, another case of an individual having an organic green drink every morning. Unfortunately, you will see this in practice. Pay close attention to women in childbearing years, because remember, this crosses the placenta. It's extremely neurotoxic. Thallium is a very dangerous exposure. Here we have another patient. This is a 50-year-old male. This patient has a chief complaint of hypertension and fatigue. Current smoker, 18 dental amalgams. This individual's blood lev is at 8.2. That's certainly associated with the tobacco exposure. Lead is also at 2.7. So there's lead that is very high, and mercury is at 3.6. Remember, we want the lead to be less than 1. So these are very high levels of these exposures in the blood. And then consequently, we see very low RBC glutathione. So that glutathione status is low. Remember, lead displaces glutathione. That's going to be a factor there. And then the DNA oxidative damage assay, 8082-deoxyguanosine, is way too low. So too high. So the patient has high metal exposure, low glutathione status, and elevated DNA oxidative damage assay. This is exactly what we've been talking about. And remember the connection between lead and endothelial dysfunction. So this is what we've been talking about with regards to mechanism of action, and here we see in practice. Here we have another case of a 59-year-old male who is a heavy smoker, hypertension, and the blood levels of cadmium and lead are elevated. Here the patient has, again, low red blood cell glutathione status, elevated DNA oxidative damage assay, and that oxidized LDL, that LDL that's participating in atherosclerosis and is at risk for plaque, is too high. Absolutely. So this is definitely a case of exposure associated with pathophysiology of cardiovascular disease and decreased detoxification ability. I know that was a lot in a short amount of time. Just to reiterate, according to the CDC, the epidemic of epidemics of cardiovascular disease, immunological, and neurological diseases is likely associated with environmental toxicants. Environmental medicine and functional medicine, this is not just about our silo. This is about human physiology and about helping people to be healthy. First thing we need to do is identify the sources, whether they're environmental, occupational, or dietary. Remove that source of exposure. That is very important. Identify and remove the exposure. Quite often I talk to physicians and they want to go a few steps beyond that. No, you need to start identifying and eliminate the source of exposure. Consider these principles of toxicology in the modern context. Consider the bioaccumulation effect, screen your patients for exposures, and reconsider what your patients might consider healthy. Unfortunately, even kale, as we've seen, may be a potent source. Test your patients, track your outcomes, support these detoxification strategies, including methylation, glutathione. Think about the cofactors, think about the molecular mimicry, and also consider other testing. We saw RBC glutathione testing to be very helpful, the DNA oxidative damage assay. Methylation is very important when we're talking about arsenic. Consider detoxification components such as the gut microbiome. And now we know that there's a significant connection between lead exposure and cardiovascular health. So consider cardiometabolic testing. All right, thank you. We now will have some time to review some questions.